The sun hovered low over the Colorado Front Range, casting a dull orange glow that made the dry August landscape appear even more scorched than usual. It was the summer of 1990, and the city of Boulder was gripped by a series of record-breaking heat waves that left lawns brittle and fire crews exhausted. At Station 14, the mood was tense but routine, a mix of weather-weary veterans and jittery rookies lingering between calls. Among them was Samuel Rourke, a 23-year veteran known for his calm under pressure and his meticulous way of checking equipment 3 times before every shift. On this particular evening, he lingered a bit longer in the gear room, slowly tightening the laces on his soot-darkened boots while the others made small talk in the rec room. Samuel had a habit of staying just slightly apart from the crew, not out of arrogance but because he believed focus was a form of respect for the job. He glanced at the black rotary phone on the wall waiting. When it rang, the sound sliced through the chatter like a blade. A 3-alarm warehouse fire on the edge of town. Everyone moved. So did Samuel, fast and quiet just like always. The old textile warehouse had been abandoned for almost a decade, sitting like a skeleton at the edge of the industrial zone near Valmont Road. No electricity, no plumbing, no recent activity on city records. That was the official description. But anyone who drove by could see the signs of life that did not belong there. Graffiti on the back walls, crushed beer cans. Sometimes the smell of burnt rubber wafted out into the street, carried on the wind like a warning. As the engines pulled up to the front of the building, flames were already licking through the roof. Black smoke curled up into the pink-stained sky. Samuel was the first to step off the rig, his gloved hand reaching for the hose as the captain barked orders to flank the fire from the north and east sides. The team moved with practiced speed. But Samuel hesitated just slightly, his gaze fixed on the second-story windows where shadows seemed to flicker behind the glass. He did not say anything. He only adjusted his helmet and stepped into the building. Inside, the heat swallowed everything. Visibility was poor, the floor sticky with chemicals that had leaked from rusted barrels years ago. Samuel pushed deeper into the structure, his breathing steady behind the mask. His axe in one hand, the flashlight in the other, he followed a narrow corridor that curved unexpectedly to the left. The hallway ended at a stairwell blocked halfway by a collapsed ceiling beam. He should have turned back. Instead, he climbed over it. At 8:41 p.m. radio contact with Samuel Rourke ended. No distress call. No final location ping. The fire was under control by 9:15 and the crew gathered outside for roll call. Samuel never came out. They searched, they dug, they sent in dogs. Nothing. Not a trace, no body, no gear, not even his helmet, just smoke and silence. For weeks after the incident, Station 14 became a shadow of itself. The men who had served with Samuel spoke in clipped tones, rarely meeting each other's eyes. Official reports blamed structural instability. The roof may have caved. The fire may have burned hotter than expected, obliterating anything organic. That was what the department said. But behind closed doors, there were murmurs of things that did not add up. One rookie claimed he saw Samuel exiting through the back entrance after the fire had been called in. Another said he found Samuel's name scratched into the wall of the basement, but the mark disappeared the next day. The captain filed his report and told everyone to move on. The city honored Samuel with a plaque, a memorial, and a folded flag. Elena Rourke, his wife of 16 years, received no remains. Just a visit from the chief and a check from the department that arrived 3 months later, folded inside a condolence card. Elena remained in the same house they had bought together in North Boulder, a small one-story with faded yellow siding and a creaky porch swing that still made noise in the wind. She left Samuel's boots by the back door untouched. Every week, she visited the station bringing sandwiches, keeping herself visible, reminding them she still believed he might come back. Not once did she cry in public. Not once did she accept the version of events handed to her. She believed something else happened that night, something that no one wanted to admit. The warehouse was torn down the following year, the land sold to a development firm that paved over the site and erected a car dealership. Elena visited it once just to walk the asphalt. She said nothing, only stood near the northwest corner and looked down at the ground for a long time. Years passed. The city changed. Fires came and went. But Station 14 kept Samuel's photo on the wall, and every August 18th the men gathered for a silent minute in front of it. New recruits asked questions. Old ones stayed quiet. Nobody ever spoke of the axe, the missing radio, or the last place Samuel was seen. Then, in the spring of 2024, during a routine inspection of a condemned building slated for demolition, something was found sealed behind a drywall panel. It was discovered by accident. A construction crew trying to reroute an electrical conduit had opened the wall and stopped cold. Inside was a firefighter's axe. The initials SR were engraved into the handle. The metal was still sharp, still stained. That was the day Elena Rourke got a call she never expected. And that was the moment the story long buried under silence and smoke began to stir back to life. The call came on a Wednesday morning, a cloudy spring day with just enough chill in the air to feel like winter had not yet surrendered. Elena Rourke was folding laundry in her small kitchen when the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Martin Kessler, a site supervisor with Boulder City's Historical Demolition Oversight Committee. He spoke formally, cautiously explaining that during scheduled demolition prep at an old print shop building downtown, his crew discovered a fire axe sealed behind a wall. The handle bore initials matching Samuel Rourke. Martin had looked up the name and found the archived case report of a missing firefighter from 1990. He thought it was worth a call. Elena's fingers went still. The folded shirt in her hands slipped onto the floor. She did not ask questions. She only asked for the address. The building sat on the corner of Walnut and 17th Street, wedged between a shuttered cafe and a converted apartment complex. The original brick structure had been overlaid with plaster in the mid-90s, then painted over again in 2002. But underneath it all, the bones remained old and worn. Elena arrived just after noon, her gray coat buttoned tightly, her eyes fixed on the boarded windows as if expecting them to blink. Martin met her by the curb. He looked younger than his voice suggested, maybe late 30s, nervous in a polite way, like a man who feared he might be stepping into someone else's private tragedy. He led her through the gutted entryway, careful to step around exposed wires and collapsed plaster. The wall had already been opened. Inside, behind the broken panels nestled between insulation and the back of an old steel support beam, the axe waited. The initials SR were unmistakable. The axe had been buried deliberately. That much was clear from the clean cuts made in the wall supports and the careful resealing of the drywall. Whoever placed it there had not been in a panic. They had taken their time. The blade was still stained, and though it had dulled slightly over the years, it remained a formidable object. Elena stepped forward, her fingers hovering just inches from the wooden handle. She did not touch it. Instead, she asked if there was any indication of how long the axe had been hidden. Martin explained that based on the layering of paint and plaster, it had likely been sealed between 1991 and 1993. He also mentioned something else. Tucked into the insulation just behind the axe was a fragment of blue fabric about the size of a handkerchief. It bore a scorch mark. No one on his team could say what it was from. Elena asked to see it. When she did, her knees buckled slightly. That fabric looked like the lining of Samuel's old duty jacket, the one she had patched herself the year before he disappeared. She took the fabric and left her fingers gripping the plastic evidence bag like it might vanish if she let go. Back home, she laid it out on the kitchen table, smoothed it with a trembling palm, and stared at it until the sun went down. That night, she opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed and retrieved a box marked with Samuel's initials. Inside were old letters department commendations, a few photographs, and one torn corner of a station inventory sheet that Samuel had scribbled on during their final vacation together. It listed names. Not just his crew, but building names and addresses, including one that matched the warehouse he vanished in. She had never paid it much attention before. Now, it felt like a map. The next day, Elena visited the Boulder Fire Department archives. She asked for copies of inspection records from the late 80s to 1990. A clerk named Leah helped her sift through microfiche and digitized scans. They found discrepancies. The warehouse where Samuel had disappeared had no inspection record after 1986. That was unusual. Properties used for storage, especially those near rail lines, were supposed to be evaluated every 18 months. More curious was that 3 other buildings Samuel had once mentioned had similarly missing records. One had burned in 1989. Another had been quietly condemned and sold to a shell company. The third had been converted into a tax office with no mention of prior structure history. Elena took notes, her mind racing. She did not have a theory yet, only questions. Later that week she met with Captain James Weller, now retired, who had served with Samuel and led the warehouse fire response team. He lived alone in a modest apartment near the foothills, surrounded by old fire memorabilia and plaques that had started to yellow. Weller greeted her cautiously. His hands trembled slightly when she mentioned the axe. She showed him a photo of it and the fabric. He sat back slowly silent for a long moment, then asked her if anyone else knew she had it. She said no. He leaned forward, his voice low. He told her something that no one had said before. The night Samuel disappeared, there had been a delay between the radio call and the deployment. 6 minutes. Enough time for someone to move deeper into the building without backup. When asked why this had never come up in reports, Weller just shook his head and said some things were better left buried. Elena left his apartment more determined than ever. Back at home, she made a list of every building Samuel had investigated, every call he made in his last 3 months. Cross-referencing with public fire records, she found a pattern. Certain properties had unusually high damage claims, but very little in the way of photographic evidence or documentation. She marked them on a map of Boulder. The result sent a chill through her. Every one of those properties formed a rough semicircle around the warehouse where Samuel vanished. It was not proof, not yet, but it was more than coincidence. She knew that whatever happened in 1990, it had not started in that fire. It had started long before. The attic had not been opened in nearly 15 years. Dust layered the wooden floorboards like snow, and the light bulb at the top of the stairs flickered uncertainly as Elena pulled the chain to turn it on. She had avoided this space not out of fear, but because it represented a past she had tried to preserve rather than disturb. Now, armed with a map of strange fires and a mounting sense that something had been buried along with her husband's name, she climbed the creaking stairs with purpose. At the far end of the attic, beneath a canvas cover and 2 boxes of Christmas decorations, sat a battered filing cabinet Samuel had once used for personal research. Elena knelt in front of it, her knees aching on the wooden planks, and pried open the bottom drawer. Inside, sealed in a plastic sleeve, was a ledger book bound in red vinyl. She recognized it instantly. It had belonged to Samuel. He had once called it his fire journal, where he recorded call notes and property observations that did not always make it into official reports. She had thought he lost it years ago. Elena carried the book downstairs and laid it open on the kitchen table. The first few pages were routine. Dates, addresses, weather notes, and shorthand comments about faulty wiring or missing permits. But as she flipped deeper into the journal, the entries became different. Samuel had started identifying what he called anomalies. Fire scenes where there had been no evidence of ignition sources. Buildings where sprinklers had failed under questionable conditions. The addresses matched the map she had created, forming a timeline of incidents that had been quietly buried in the city's bureaucratic records. Each entry had been annotated with symbols she did not immediately understand. Some were stars. Others were small triangles or question marks. She remembered Samuel had once created his own code during his arson training days. It was how he tracked suspicion versus coincidence. Near the back of the ledger, she found a list titled Potential Connections. Names were scrawled beneath it in capital letters. Among them were 2 contractors, a fire inspector, and 1 city councilman. She paused at that last name. Darrell Knox. She remembered it from campaign signs. He was now running for mayor. Back in 1990, Knox had been a young council aide. Samuel had mentioned him once in passing, describing him as someone ambitious and eager to get into redevelopment deals. Elena did not have proof of anything illegal, but the presence of that name in her husband's personal ledger raised immediate red flags. She copied the page and stored the original in a fireproof envelope in her closet. Then she began researching every name on that list. Over the next week, Elena visited the Boulder Public Library's archive section. She reviewed news clippings, property ownership filings, and campaign donations. Patterns began to emerge. The two contractors had both worked on post-fire demolition and reconstruction projects for the city. They often won bids for condemned properties, including the warehouse where Samuel vanished. The fire inspector had resigned quietly in early 1991 and relocated out of state. Darrell Knox, meanwhile, had built his political career on promises of urban renewal and economic growth. He never referenced the fires, but one article from 1993 included a photo of him at a groundbreaking event on the same block where the axe had been found. In the background, barely visible, stood the old print shop building. Elena printed the article and marked it with a note. The coincidences were piling up. Elena's next step was a difficult one. She contacted Julia Fairmont, an investigative reporter for the local newspaper who had covered city corruption stories in the late 90s. They met at a cafe near Pearl Street. Elena arrived early, clutching the copied ledger pages in a manila envelope. Julia was in her 40s now, with sharp eyes and a quiet intensity. After Elena explained everything she had uncovered, Julia sat back in her chair and nodded slowly. She told Elena that Samuel had contacted her once before his disappearance asking for a meeting. It never happened. He canceled the day before, saying something came up. Julia never heard from him again. Until now. They agreed to work together with Julia, offering to vet the names and verify the chain of ownership on the burned properties. Elena handed her the copies. She would keep the original until she knew it was safe to do otherwise. That evening, Elena returned home to find her front door slightly ajar. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing appeared out of place. But she knew with certainty that someone had entered her house. The drawer where she kept the ledger was open. The envelope inside had been moved. It was subtle but undeniable. She immediately called Julia and told her everything. Julia suggested she store the ledger off-site. Elena agreed and drove to her sister's house across town. There, she placed the envelope in a safe behind the laundry room wall. Only her sister Maria would know it was there. The incident rattled her more than she expected. That night, sleep came in fragments. Every creak of the house set her nerves on edge. She lay in bed replaying everything she had learned. Samuel had been close to uncovering something. He had left a trail, intentionally or not, and someone had noticed. She could not shake the image of his axe behind that wall, sealed away like a warning or a secret someone never wanted found. The ledger had survived, so had the truth, and she would not let it be buried again. The following morning, Elena returned to the library archives, her hands still trembling slightly from the uneasy sleep. She wanted to double-check a detail she had overlooked. In Samuel's journal, the name Charles Weathers appeared 3 times each beside a different fire scene, and always underlined twice. Charles Weathers had been a fire inspector for Boulder from 1984 until his abrupt resignation in early 1991. Public records showed he moved to Fort Collins and later to a small town in New Mexico. Elena found an old staff photograph from a fire department annual newsletter. In it, Weathers stood on the far right arms, folded, wearing a sour expression that made him stand out. She scanned the image into her phone and sent it to Julia, asking her to see what else she could find about him. Less than 2 hours later, Julia called back with an address. The man now lived in a cabin just outside Ruidoso, listed under his middle name, but the birth date and employment history matched. Elena packed a small overnight bag and called Maria to let her know she was leaving town. Driving through Colorado's southern border and into New Mexico took most of the day. Elena arrived at the foot of a winding gravel road by dusk. The address led to a modest wooden cabin nestled among tall pines. A rusted mailbox leaned sideways at the entrance, and a battered pickup truck sat half-hidden behind a shed. Elena parked her car and approached the front door. She hesitated for a moment before knocking. The door opened a crack, and a narrow pair of eyes stared back at her. The man on the other side looked older than his 67 years. He wore a heavy flannel shirt and jeans, his hair mostly white and cut short. Elena introduced herself using her maiden name, knowing full well what his reaction might be. When she mentioned Samuel Rourke, his face changed. He opened the door fully and told her to come inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and old coffee. Papers and books were stacked neatly along the walls. Weathers moved slowly, favoring his left leg as he poured himself a drink and asked Elena to sit. He had not heard that Samuel's axe had been found, and the news seemed to weigh heavily on him. After a long silence, he said he had expected this day would come. Elena listened carefully as he began to speak. He did not claim innocence, nor did he appear surprised that someone had come looking for answers. He told her about the final months before his resignation, how a series of fire reports had been modified or lost, how pressure had come from city offices to classify certain structures as low risk. He had flagged 3 properties for arson investigation, but was told to stand down. When he pushed back, he received a notice of administrative leave. That was when he packed up and left Boulder. Elena asked him directly if he knew her husband had been investigating the same fires. Weathers nodded. He said Samuel had reached out to him twice in late 1989, once in person and once by phone. They had spoken briefly with Samuel, asking pointed questions about fire suppression systems and inspection logs. Weathers had warned him to be careful. At the time, Samuel had seemed calm but focused. Weathers had not heard from him again. After the warehouse fire, he assumed the worst. He had never spoken publicly about the irregularities, fearing retaliation or legal repercussions. But now, with his name unearthed and Elena standing in his living room, he agreed to make a statement. He would write down everything he remembered. It was not much, but it was a start. The next morning, Elena drove back to Colorado with a written account and a voice recording of their conversation. She met Julia at her office and handed over the documents. Julia promised to verify the story and follow up with contacts in city planning. The pieces were slowly aligning. Between Samuel's journal, the map of fires, and Weathers' statement, a broader pattern emerged. Several properties had changed hands in quick succession after fires, often for a fraction of their market value. The new owners were connected by either financial ties or shared contractors. In many cases, redevelopment occurred within 18 months, usually subsidized by city grants aimed at economic revitalization. It was not just negligence, it was deliberate and well executed. And Samuel had found it. Elena returned home exhausted. That night, she received a call from an unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. The message was short. A male voice said her husband had been warned and that some truths should remain buried. She saved the recording and forwarded it to Julia. Fear bloomed in her chest, but it was no longer enough to stop her. She now had a timeline, multiple witnesses, and proof of tampered inspections. But what she lacked was the link to the person at the top. She needed more than circumstantial evidence. She needed something irrefutable. Over the next few days, she combed through more of Samuel's old boxes, looking for anything he might have saved. In one folder, she found copies of service orders from a private security firm that had worked for the city. One document stood out. It referenced surveillance camera placement at the very warehouse where Samuel vanished. The invoice was dated 3 days before the fire. Elena cross-checked the firm's name with current city vendors and discovered they still had contracts with municipal departments. She contacted Julia again. If those cameras had recorded anything the night of the fire, the footage might still exist, archived or forgotten in some neglected server. It was a long shot, but she had learned by now that even long shots could matter. The municipal records office was located inside a gray building tucked between 2 parking garages on the east side of downtown. Elena arrived early in the morning with a signed research request from Julia, which gave her access to restricted digital archives for historical city infrastructure. She explained to the clerk that she was researching building surveillance systems used in municipal properties from 1990 and mentioned the contract number tied to the security firm listed on Samuel's copied document. The clerk, a young woman named Maya, hesitated at first, but after scanning the barcode on the request and confirming Julia's credentials, she led Eliana down a narrow corridor to a windowless room filled with old terminals and stacked hard drives. Most people requested zoning maps or scanned permits. Almost no one asked for video archives. Elena was given a terminal and a logbook listing city properties that had surveillance contracts in the late 80s. Most of the entries were government buildings like libraries, maintenance yards, or administrative offices. She flipped through the pages slowly until she found the listing for 4,580 Ridgeview Lane, the former warehouse address. The listing confirmed a short-term camera installation from August 13th to August 18th of 1990. That date sent a jolt through her spine. The fire occurred on August 18th, the last day of the recorded footage. She asked Maya if the tapes had been digitized. Maya checked the index and nodded. The files had been migrated onto a secure backup drive years ago. After verifying her request again, she granted Elena access to the footage folder, which was stored on a separate terminal. Elena sat in front of the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The folder contained 6 days of footage broken into hourly segments. Most files were labeled automatically by date and camera angle. She opened the file for August 18th at 7:00 p.m. The black and white footage loaded slowly. The angle showed the rear loading dock of the warehouse. Nothing moved at first, then a van appeared backing up to the bay door. Elena leaned forward. The timestamp read 7:22 p.m. 2 men exited the vehicle. They wore work uniforms but had no visible company logos. One of them approached the door and used a key. The footage had no audio, but the man's body language showed urgency. The second man stayed near the van, unloading what appeared to be plastic containers. At 7:34 p.m., another figure appeared from the side alley. He wore a firefighter's jacket. Elena's breath caught. The figure had a familiar gait, squared shoulders, and a slight limp. She recognized the way Samuel had always favored his right side when walking. The camera resolution was too poor to see his face, but everything in her body told her it was him. The footage continued. Samuel entered the warehouse. The men did not stop him. One pointed inside as if guiding him. Minutes passed. At 7:51 p.m., heavy smoke began to pour from the back door. The 2 men reappeared this time without the containers. They climbed into the van and drove away. Samuel did not return. The footage ended at 8:00 p.m. Elena sat back, hands trembling. This was not an accident. Someone had lured Samuel there. Someone had made sure he would not come back. She downloaded the footage onto a flash drive and immediately called Julia. They met that evening in a parking lot near the newspaper office. Julia watched the video in silence, then turned to Elena and said they needed legal counsel. This was no longer a pattern. It was now direct evidence of intentional misconduct and probable foul play. Julia contacted a lawyer she trusted who specialized in whistleblower protection and government fraud. His name was Peter Langford. They agreed to meet the following morning. Peter Langford was a deliberate man in his early 50s with a calm demeanor that settled the room. He reviewed the footage, listened to Weathers's statement, and examined Samuel's journal pages. Then he asked a question that neither Julia nor Elena had fully considered. He asked whether anyone else from Station 14 might still be alive who had been present that night. Elena paused. There had been a few. She remembered one name, Alan Vickers, a paramedic who had transferred out shortly after the fire. She offered to try and find him. Peter advised them to proceed carefully. The moment they made this information public, they would face pressure. Legal, political, and maybe worse. Elena spent the next 2 days trying to locate Alan Vickers. Through old union directories and online records, she found a residential address in Pueblo, Colorado. She drove there on a Sunday morning, unsure of what she would find. The house was modest, with a cracked walkway and a faded basketball hoop above the garage. A man in his 60s answered the door, thin and pale, with deep lines around his eyes. She asked if he was Alan. He said yes. Then she mentioned the warehouse fire. He went very quiet. They sat on his porch. Alan told her that he had always believed something was wrong with that night. He had seen the van Samuel enter alone and had raised concerns, but was told by the captain to stand down. The captain claimed the building was clear. When the fire intensified, they were told to pull back for safety reasons. Alan had obeyed, but carried the guilt ever since. He had heard whispers afterward, a rumor that the fire had been meant to erase something. Samuel had stumbled into something bigger than a single fire. Alan had tried to forget, but now, seeing Elena standing there, he agreed to speak on record. Elena sat in her car outside a community center where Daryl Knox was scheduled to speak. The afternoon sun filtered through the windshield, casting sharp lines across the dashboard. She held a printed still image from the surveillance footage in her lap, the timestamp and grainy figures etched into her memory. Knox's name had appeared in Samuel's journal for a reason, and now, watching campaign volunteers set up chairs and arrange banners near the front door, she could feel the weight of unfinished business pressing harder on her chest. This was the man whose real estate initiatives had thrived in the aftermath of those fires. He had risen through city council ranks with surprising speed. If anyone had a motive to keep the truth buried, she believed it was him. She had no plan to confront him in public. Instead, she walked inside quietly and took a seat in the back of the room. Knox appeared 10 minutes later, wearing a tailored suit and flashing practice smiles. He spoke with confidence about community development, job creation, and sustainable housing. The audience clapped at regular intervals. Elena watched his eyes, looking for signs of guilt or memory. When the talk ended, she followed him outside, keeping a careful distance. She noted the license plate of his car. That would be enough for now. Back at home, Elena gave the plate number to Julia, who ran it through her contacts. The car was registered under a campaign donor's name, but had been cited for parking violations multiple times near the same two addresses in 2023. One of those addresses belonged to a downtown law firm. The other was an industrial property still owned by a holding company that had purchased several burned parcels back in the early 90s. Julia visited the industrial property, a warehouse now leased as storage for construction equipment. She took photographs and noted a security system recently installed, despite the property having no permanent staff on site. Peter Langford reviewed the findings and advised a cautious approach. He said the best strategy was not confrontation but exposure. Elena agreed. They would gather statements and evidence, then deliver everything to both legal authorities and the press at the same time. No one would have time to cover it up. Peter reached out to a federal investigator with ties to the Department of Justice. The contact agreed to review the case file discreetly and assess whether a formal investigation could be justified. It would take time, but they were no longer working alone. One night, as Elena sat on her porch watching the last of the daylight fade, she received a package without a return address. Inside was a manila envelope containing a printed photo. It was the same image she had viewed dozens of times, but this one was clearer. It showed the van from the surveillance footage, and in the background, half in shadow, stood a man whose face was just barely visible. Elena stared at the face, her pulse quickening. The photo had been cropped to remove surroundings. There was no note inside, no explanation, but she knew the image had come from someone with access to the original files, or perhaps someone who had once been inside the system. She showed the photo to Julia and Peter the next morning. Julia used facial comparison software and ran the image through old employee databases. Within hours, she had a name. The man was Richard Dunn, a former facilities manager for the city who had retired in 1994 and disappeared from public record. Dunn had signed off on multiple contracts involving property demolition and redevelopment. He had also signed the security request for the camera installation at the warehouse. If they could find him, he might be the last missing link. Elena and Julia followed a trail through old pension records and DMV updates. Eventually, they found a mobile address registered to a post office box in Trinidad, Colorado. The town sat near the state line, small and quiet, with rolling hills and dusty storefronts. They drove there together, hoping to find someone who knew where Dunn had gone. At the local diner, they met a waitress named Claire, who recognized the photo. She said the man sometimes picked up groceries and rarely spoke to anyone. He lived in a trailer park west of town near a dry creek bed. They found the trailer the next morning. It was surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusting yard tools. Elena knocked once, then again. After a long pause, the door opened. Richard Dunn stood there, aged and weary, his eyes ringed with red. Elena explained who she was. He nodded slowly and stepped aside. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and dust. He sat at the kitchen table and asked her what she wanted. She said she wanted the truth. Dunn sighed, ran a hand through thinning hair, and looked out the window for a long time before speaking. He admitted to overseeing the cleanup operations for several fires. He said he had been instructed to move equipment sign-off on inspections and shut down surveillance after key dates. When asked who gave those instructions, he hesitated, then said most came from the office of then-Councilman Darrell Knox. Dunn claimed he was never told the full reason why, only that it involved city redevelopment priorities. He expressed guilt especially about the night Samuel disappeared. He remembered seeing Samuel arrive and being told to leave before the fire began. He left because he believed he had no choice. He agreed to testify if formally subpoenaed. Peter Langford filed the formal request to the Department of Justice within a week of Richard Dunn's testimony. The affidavit included copies of the surveillance footage, the ledger, Samuel's journal, Charles Weathers's written statement, and now Dunn's detailed account. The evidence formed a timeline that spanned nearly 4 decades. It tied multiple fires' fraudulent inspections and city redevelopment deals to specific individuals. It was no longer just a case of a missing firefighter. It had become a question of institutional failure and possible criminal conspiracy. The federal investigator reviewed the materials and agreed there was sufficient cause to present the case to a grand jury. The proceedings would be confidential. Witnesses would be subpoenaed. Elena would finally see the machinery of justice begin to turn. The grand jury convened in Denver under federal jurisdiction, removing the possibility of local interference. Julia published a limited piece in the paper to signal the beginning of the case without revealing too much. Public attention stirred, and talk radio stations speculated about corruption investigations. Knox's office issued a vague statement denying any wrongdoing. He continued his mayoral campaign, now shadowed by rumors. Elena stayed in Boulder, but remained in contact with Peter daily. She knew better than to expect quick answers. But this was more than she had ever imagined possible in those years when no one would even speak her husband's name. When Charles Weathers received his subpoena, he called Elena. His voice carried a mixture of fear and relief. He had lived in isolation for so long that the idea of facing a courtroom made his hands shake, but he said he was ready. Julia arranged for security support just in case. Alan Vickers also received his summons. His statement had been shorter, but his presence carried weight. A surviving first responder who had been silenced by protocol for decades could shift a jury's perception in ways evidence could not. Both men were prepared to speak under oath. Richard Dunn's appearance was the most delicate. He agreed to testify only after being granted limited immunity for past actions. Peter negotiated the terms carefully. Dunn would not be charged for his part in surveillance suppression or property handling provided he told the full truth. On the day he entered the courthouse, Elena stood across the street and watched. He moved slowly, almost like a man walking into confession. She had no love for him, but she recognized that without him, the case would never have made it this far. Elena herself was not asked to testify. Instead, her documentation and records were entered as evidence. Her role, Peter said, was already embedded in every part of the case. She had followed the trail when no one else did. That week, she spent hours walking familiar streets in Boulder, looking at the places that had once seemed ordinary but now felt charged with meaning. She walked past the old site of the warehouse, now a used car dealership with blinking signs and faded paint. She stopped at the sidewalk and looked across the lot, wondering if anyone else passing by had any idea what had once been buried beneath their feet. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When the news came, it arrived as a press bulletin just after noon. The grand jury had returned indictments on 3 individuals. 2 were lower-level officials who had approved false documents tied to the warehouse fire and other properties. The third was Darryl Knox. He was indicted on multiple counts including fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy related to the intentional suppression of fire investigations. His arrest was ordered immediately. Elena saw the footage on the news later that evening. Knox stood in a Navy suit at the top of City Hall steps as 2 federal agents escorted him away. He said nothing. His eyes never met the cameras. The charges were just the beginning. The city released a public statement acknowledging the severity of the case. A task force was formed to audit redevelopment records going back 30 years. Elena received a call from the fire chief. He offered his apology and asked if the department could formally honor Samuel's service during an upcoming memorial ceremony. She agreed, but made it clear she was not looking for closure. She was looking for correction. The plaque at Station 14 had always read in memory of our lost brother. Now it would include a date of death and a formal acknowledgement of duty. That mattered. Julia published the full story 2 days after the indictments. The headline was simple. It read, "He walked into the fire." The article recounted the timeline and included quotes from Elena Weathers and Vickers. Public reaction was immediate. Letters poured in from former firefighters, city workers, and residents who remembered the fires and had long suspected something deeper. Some wrote to Elena personally. One man sent a photo of Samuel from 1985 saying he had once been saved during a structure collapse and never forgot the man who pulled him out. Elena kept the letter in a drawer by her bed. 2 weeks after the indictments, the city authorized a comprehensive inspection of Station 14. The review was symbolic, at first meant to honor Samuel and reaffirm the department's commitment to transparency. But when engineers entered the oldest wing of the building, sealed off for years due to outdated wiring and water damage, they found inconsistencies in the floor structure. Beneath the training room, where Samuel once ran drills, a small crawlspace extended beyond the original blueprint. The entry was hidden behind old lockers that had been bolted shut. When the panel was removed, the space revealed a dark, narrow chamber filled with dust and silence. At first glance, it appeared empty, but as workers advanced with flashlights, something caught in the beam, a section of scorched wood, then a boot, then fragments of fabric embedded in soot. The discovery halted everything. The fire chief contacted authorities. Forensic teams arrived that evening, cordoning off the station and cataloging the scene. What they found confirmed what Elena had never dared to hope for: human remains, scattered across the crawlspace floor, partially covered by debris and melted wiring. The dental records matched Samuel Rourke. After 34 years, he had been found. The location stunned the department. No one could explain how his body had ended up under the very building where he had worked. Elena arrived at the scene just after dawn. The chief met her outside and led her to a private tent set up near the station's rear entrance. She stood quietly as the forensic pathologist explained the condition of the remains. The body showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, as well as deep bruising along the ribs. The injury pattern suggested that Samuel had not died in the fire but had been moved after death. The crawlspace showed no signs of fire damage beyond surface soot. Someone had placed him there, perhaps the same night of the fire, perhaps later. The axe, the fabric, and the absence of blood in the original warehouse site made new sense now. It had all been a diversion. Elena listened without emotion. The numbness settled deep in her chest. She'd imagined for years that his body might have been lost, consumed by heat, or buried in concrete. But never here. Never in the shadow of the place he had dedicated his life to. She asked to see what had been found. The forensics team allowed her to approach. She saw the remnants of his jacket, the fire tag still half attached to the collar, and one of his gloves turned inside out like it had been pulled off in haste. She did not cry. She only nodded and stepped back, her hands shaking. There were no words to offer the weight of such a moment. That evening, Peter Langford filed a motion to reopen parts of the criminal case based on new physical evidence. The judge granted it, citing the discovery of the body as a turning point. The indictment against Knox gained weight. Charges were upgraded to include conspiracy to conceal a homicide. Forensic analysts determined that Samuel had been struck with an object consistent with the back of a steel tool. It could have been a wrench. It could have been the handle of his own axe. That detail remained uncertain. But the pattern of injury was clear. He had died before the fire. He had never had a chance to call for help. Station 14 closed temporarily. City officials held a press conference acknowledging the oversight and pledging full cooperation. Public outcry surged again. Protesters gathered outside City Hall demanding accountability for everyone who had participated in the cover-up. Former department heads were questioned. Internal emails and storage logs were reviewed. The evidence trail pointed toward a network of complicity rather than a lone act. Samuel had been silenced because he knew too much, and those responsible had assumed time would erase the rest. They had buried him beneath the building he once trusted. Julia wrote a second feature titled, "He Was Always Here." The story traced the journey from Elena's first discovery to the moment her husband's remains were uncovered. It included interviews with retired firefighters, new recruits, and residents who remembered Samuel's disappearance. The paper published letters from readers expressing shock, grief, and gratitude. One firefighter who had just joined the department wrote about how the truth changed his understanding of duty. He said courage was not just about walking into a fire. It was about what you stood for long after the flames were gone. Elena took possession of Samuel's remains after the autopsy. The city offered to host a full honors ceremony, and she accepted. The memorial was held at the base of the foothills where Samuel had often gone hiking with his daughter. Fire engines lined the road. Bagpipes played. Current and former firefighters stood in uniform saluting as the casket passed. The plaque at Station 14 was unveiled again, this time with new words engraved in steel. It read, "In honor of Samuel Rourke, who gave everything and in doing so revealed the truth." Elena stood beside it and placed her hand on the metal. It was warm from the sun. 3 days after the memorial, Elena received an email from a name she did not recognize. The subject line read Archive Room C Inquiry. The body of the message was brief and direct. It stated that a forgotten municipal archive room had been unsealed during the expansion of the county records office downtown. The attached photo showed a door marked C with a faded keycard lock. Elena forwarded the email to Julia and Peter, both of whom contacted city offices to confirm its legitimacy. By noon, the director of records confirmed the discovery. The room had been sealed since 1992. No one could explain why it had not appeared on internal maps. The expansion crew had discovered it by accident when a temporary partition wall was removed. Elena arrived the next morning wearing her husband's old department windbreaker. The archive building was sterile and modern, with brushed metal stair railings and a polished concrete floor. But the back corridor near Room C told a different story. The walls there were lined with original drywall from the 1980s, and the air carried a faint scent of mildew. The door itself had a damaged card reader and rust along the hinges. Maintenance workers had already removed the lock. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a narrow room with no windows and rows of metal shelves. Boxes were stacked shoulder-high, covered in layers of dust. Inside the room, Elena and Julia were joined by a city records analyst named Darren, who wore gloves and a mask. He explained that no official log existed for the contents. The boxes had labels handwritten in red ink, mostly strings of numbers followed by initials. Julia began photographing each box while Elena opened them one at a time. Most contained fire inspection files, raw footage reels, and incident reports never digitized. One file included a full report on a 1987 fire at a dental office that Samuel had mentioned in his journal. The report had been marked as accidental, but the photos showed accelerant patterns on the ceiling tiles. Further in, Elena opened a box labeled with the same initials that had appeared in her husband's journal. The initials DK were scrawled across several folders. Inside one folder was a series of memos between city council aides. One memo discussed the financial viability of accelerated redevelopment projects following minor disasters. Another referenced expedited demolition permits. These were not just speculative theories. These were operational instructions. The memos made it clear that fires were viewed as convenient resets for difficult properties. The notes carried dates, author names, and routing instructions. Some were stamped confidential. Julia photographed every page. Elena scanned the names and dates, cross-referencing them with Samuel's notes. One folder listed security contractors and temporary personnel. She recognized one name immediately. It was the same person who had driven the van in the surveillance footage. The man had signed off on 2 surveillance deployments in August of 1990 and had requested reimbursement for damaged equipment days after the warehouse fire. The paper trail had been there all along, just locked away behind a forgotten wall. In the corner of the room they found a stack of VHS tapes. Most were unlabeled, but 3 had markings consistent with old municipal footage codes. A technician from the city archives brought in a portable player. They watched the first tape. The footage showed a planning meeting undated with 6 men seated around a table. One of them was unmistakably younger, Daryl Knox. The conversation was difficult to hear due to static, but at one point he leaned forward and said the phrase "contingency fire protocol." The others nodded. One even laughed. No one looked surprised. No one questioned what it meant. Peter reviewed the footage the next day. He said it was damning not only for criminal proceedings, but also for public transparency. The room had preserved everything: handwritten notes, financial ledgers, video evidence. There could be no defense of ignorance. Knox's legal team attempted to block the footage from entering evidence, but the judge overruled. The tapes would be presented in full during trial. The room was sealed again under federal order, and the contents were cataloged for court. Elena sat quietly that night in her kitchen. The overhead light hummed softly. She reviewed the digital copies Julia had saved onto a drive. Her hands moved slowly across the keyboard. She paused on a scan of a memo from 1989. The note referenced a fire drill schedule and included a list of buildings to be tested. The final line read Consult SR before confirmation. Those initials, her husband's. It meant someone in that office had trusted him, or at least involved him before turning on him. She realized the betrayal ran even deeper than she thought. At dawn the next day, Elena returned to Station 14. The building remained closed to the public, but the chief allowed her access. She walked the length of the bay floor, stopping near the training room. The silence was different now. It no longer carried the weight of loss, it carried the weight of truth. Samuel had never walked away. He had been taken, but he had not disappeared. He had left signs, notes, codes, shadows, in the places no one thought to look. Elena placed a single photograph of him on the windowsill. In it, he stood smiling in front of the engine bay helmet tucked under his arm. Behind him, the station walls still looked new. The courtroom filled slowly that morning. Sunlight pushed through the high windows, casting soft bars of light across the hardwood floors. Elena sat in the second row behind the prosecution's table, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Peter Langford stood beside her, glancing occasionally at his notes but saying little. On the far side of the room, Daryl Knox entered in a dark suit, his expression fixed and unreadable. His legal team surrounded him, speaking in hushed tones. The jury filed in shortly after, and the judge called the court to order. The air inside the room settled into silence, the kind of silence that came when everyone present understood something irreversible was about to unfold. The trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution led with the surveillance footage, followed by testimony from Charles Weathers, Alan Vickers, and Richard Dunn. Each man recounted what he had seen, what he had heard, and what he had chosen not to say until now. Their voices carried weight not because they were polished, but because they were burdened. The jury listened intently. Faces shifted with each new piece of evidence. Then came the memo, files, the video from Archive Room C, and the final ledger pages from Samuel's journal. Peter read aloud several passages in a calm and steady voice. Each time he said Samuel's name, Elena felt a mixture of pride and sorrow. Her husband had never stood in that courtroom, but his presence filled every corner of it. Knox's defense argued a procedural failure and misinterpretation. They claimed redevelopment efforts were standard practice, that the fires were coincidental, and that decisions made in the past could not be judged by the standards of today. But the evidence had no ambiguity. The coordination was clear. The cover-ups were deliberate. The harm done could not be rationalized by growth or profit. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room emptied slowly. Elena remained seated. She watched the light shift across the floor, watched her reflection in the polished bench in front of her, and thought about the first time Samuel kissed her cheek before heading into a call. He had never said goodbye, only see you when I get back. That promise had lived in her for 34 years. The verdict came the next afternoon. Guilty on all counts. Knox stood motionless as the judge read the findings. Elena closed her eyes. Her fingers curled gently into her palms. There were no cheers, no gasps, only the quiet rhythm of justice being rendered. Knox would face sentencing the following month. Others connected to the case faced separate charges. The city issued formal apologies to families affected by the fires. A task force began compiling a list of properties marked for review. The fire department reopened investigations from the late 80s through early 90s. The seal of silence had finally broken. Weeks later, Elena stood at the edge of a grassy field near the northern line of Boulder. The air smelled of pine and distant rain. A new memorial stood there now, a curved wall of stone with names carved into it. Not just Samuel's, but those of 3 other firefighters lost under mysterious circumstances from that same era. Their deaths had never been linked until now. Julia had discovered their stories during the trial and pushed to include them. The wall faced the mountains. Behind it, a small garden grew with wildflowers and native shrubs. A single bench overlooked the scene. At the base of the memorial sat a plaque that read, "In their silence, we found the truth." The dedication ceremony was quiet and dignified. Elena gave a short speech not about vengeance or guilt, but about perseverance. She spoke about the years when no one believed her, the nights filled with unanswered questions, and the morning when the axe was found. She said Samuel had always believed in systems, in structures that held people up. That belief had not been misplaced. It had only been delayed. When she finished, a single bell rang out from Station 14, carried across the field on the wind. Firefighters saluted, friends embraced. Elena sat on the bench and watched the clouds move slowly across the sky. That night, she returned home to a house that no longer felt like a waiting room. The photos on the mantel seemed clearer, the corners of the rooms less heavy. She opened the drawer by her bed and removed the letter from the man who had once been saved by Samuel. She read it again, slowly. Then she placed it beside the journal. She had started a small foundation in Samuel's name. It would help fund firehouse training, whistleblower protection for first responders, and independent audits for urban redevelopment. The foundation received its first donation from a retired firefighter in California who had read Julia's article. He wrote simply, "I know what it feels like to be afraid and still go in anyway." In the days that followed, Elena received dozens of emails, letters, and calls. Some were from old friends, others from strangers. They shared memories, confessions, and sometimes just gratitude. People who had felt overlooked now saw in her story a path forward. She never considered herself brave. She only knew what it felt like to lose someone and refuse to let them vanish without reason. She had carried Samuel's memory like a second spine. It had kept her upright when everything else bent. Elena walked through Boulder now with a different gaze. She saw the buildings Samuel once inspected, the streets they had walked together, the old diner where he had spilled coffee on his report sheets and laughed about it for days. She did not erase the past. She integrated it. When asked by a local school to speak about justice, she told the students that some truths do not come quickly, that sometimes justice has to be built slowly, like a fire that finds oxygen in unexpected places. She told them that the stories we tell ourselves about the past matter because they shape what we do next. In her final letter to the city council before stepping down from her volunteer advisory role, she wrote that healing does not come from apology alone. It comes from accountability. It comes from being willing to look directly at what we once ignored. She asked that every new firefighter learn about the case not as a cautionary tale but as a lesson in courage. Courage, not just to run into fires but to speak when others fall silent. She asked that they remember Samuel Rourke not just as a man who vanished, but as one who left behind the instructions for how to find him. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like and subscribe for more true inspired mysteries. We would love to hear your thoughts on the plot and where you are watching from, so drop a comment below and join the conversation.